Yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm honored to be part of this ISHRE series on women. And the topic that I'm going to talk about is eco spaces, designing low carbon, visual, and thermal comfort systems. By itself, a very big topic, so please pardon me, I'll be just going through patches of it. What I'll cover today is basically a little bit of why background, the aspects of why we need to do these things, a little bit of energy efficient building envelope, the thermal comfort, visual comfort, and then probably one case study. I actually had more, but I just deleted most of it because I think we will be short of time. So let me start with saying that the need for this is that we all know that climate change is not just imminent, it is here. And being a developing country, our carbon emissions are on the rise. We are a developing country, one of the topmost in the world, maybe fourth in the world. And if you look at China, it's almost reached the top now. It has gone past US and we are fourth. And that's even though our per capita carbon emissions are low, overall we are still very high because of the huge population. And we know that the effects of these carbon dioxide emissions is that the glaciers, the various ice glaciers in the north, in the Himalayas, they're melting. And overall, this is having a change, an effect in the climate of the entire Earth. All the ecosystems, all the systems are getting affected, the ocean and everything. And we can see the weather patterns. It's all now, it's a fact, no longer people are questioning it. So if you look at the future, what are the challenges for us? So this is what the IPCC has shown us, that if we want to have a reduction, or we want to have the global warming levels by up to 1.5 degrees centigrade, then we have to follow a very tragic, drastic, step down from our current levels. This is our current levels. If you want to look at 2 degrees centigrade overall rise in global temperature, which itself will have many global ramifications, many islands will be underwater, maybe even Mumbai. So then we'll have to reduce to a certain extent. But if we go along the current path, we are definitely not going to, survive. So it seems that we will have to make drastic changes, not only into our buildings, also into our behaviors. But in every little thing of life, we will have to make that change, from getting used to energy, energy rich spaces. We'll have to look at designing and making everything into low carbon. I just want to quickly give you some facts about India. Our floor space of buildings is expanding, and every by 2050 we're expecting about 35 billion square meter of new buildings, and yet out of that 60% is not constructed. And as per, I think this is a old data, still we have 38% of the total energy consumption, electricity consumption from buildings, of which you can see 28% is residential or domestic and 10% is commercial. Some more facts about the electricity consumption. The biggest rise is going to be in the residential sector, where by 2032, we are going to see that 37% alone is going to be from the residential sector. This increase is also because of the use of air conditioning for cooling and for thermal comfort. Fans and space cooling are today the largest, 33 to 65% of the electricity consumption. And electricity demand due to residential sector is going to rise. Given the number of people we have to accommodate, people are going to move from villages to tier 3 cities, tier 2 cities, and so on. Overall, buildings have many impacts, and key among them is the energy consumption by the buildings. During the operational phase of the buildings, they consume a lot of energy, and that is almost amounting to 50% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Apart from that, we have not even counted the material floor, the water that we consume in buildings, and the waste that is generated, not only the municipal solid waste, but also on demolition, the debris, and so on. So all these are impacts of buildings. And so if you look at overall the built environment, it is next only to agriculture in the impact on our Earth's ecosystems. So we as architects, interior designers, whoever, MEP consultants, we have drastically changed the face of the planet in many ways, and we need to change that. We need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions, that is oil, coal, and gas, and start designing low carbon buildings. So when we talk about low carbon design, and especially with respect to thermal comfort and visual comfort, I just want to give a few areas that you can focus on for today. And uh, one is the efficiency of the equipments that we use, which is, I think most of you are engineers or architects or interior designers. So equipments, that is lighting, HVAC, the computers, how efficient we can make them, that is one part. The second part is the building envelope itself, which I'll be talking about to a large extent today. And the third part is to substitute the rest of the energy with renewable energy. So I just want to give you a larger framework that how can you make low carbon buildings? Because the building has to be made as per the climate of the place, then it will definitely be low carbon, because it responds to the climate, and therefore it is not just a block which can be fitted anywhere. So therefore it responds to the climate, and therefore it will be low energy. It responds to the thermal and visual comfort of the occupants, and therefore also that it is not a general design. And then finally, how we can reduce and eliminate the non-renewable energy and go for renewable energy. So this is the whole perspective that we are looking at. In terms of building, just to give you an introduction about the building envelope. So the envelope is like the third skin. There can be, just like for our body to be balanced in terms of thermal energy, even the building is like a third skin, because we have our own skin, then we have the clothes, and then we have the building. So that building is like, it is also exchanging heat from the environment, just based on whatever is outside, and it follows the simple laws of thermodynamics. So depending upon the outside temperature, it either loses or gains heat, and there has to be a balance that needs to be maintained. A structure which doesn't need to lose a lot of heat or gain a lot of heat, and it remains in balance, is a structure that will consume less energy. And if you see our own buildings of the past, we had these huge massive walls in our villages, like 2 feet walls or something like that, made of mud, and the heat could never reach the other side. By the time it would come to somewhere in the middle, it will have to go back. So basically the thermal lag was used as a means of making buildings thermally comfortable. So I want to go a little bit more on building envelope and give you a few facts and important maybe concepts which are really important in the design of buildings. So the building envelope, that is the floor, the walls, the windows, roof, this is the building envelope. That keeps exchanging heat with the surrounding environment by three processes, that is conduction, convection, and radiation. Basically, the heat source is the solar radiation of the sun, the short wave radiation, and that is either absorbed by the structure, and it is emitted, or it is you directly receive also short wave radiation through the windows, and then you have the convectional movement of the air. So in the design of the building envelope, there can be several things that can be done, and I want to explain a few of these things. For example, you already know about shading devices, which can make a drastic difference to the direct heat gain inside your building. Then you can have a proper U value, or the thermal transmittance value of your walls and your roofs and on your windows. And I'll talk to you in a bit about it. You also need to have a proper solar heat gain coefficient. You can decide the window to wall ratio. If you recall, in Rajasthan, for example, we have smaller windows. In maybe Kerala, we have, the walls are no longer there, the walls are windows. So there is a different kind of pattern used everywhere, and that is nothing but the same concept of window wall ratio, which we're talking about. And of course, orientation, wherever possible to have the right orientation is very important. And the internal layout is important, because if you have the habitable spaces which are not direct in the direct path of your heat zone, then that will be much better. So if you have buffer spaces like balconies, verandas, even maybe toilets or staircase blocks or something. So that is also another way of looking at it. That's the spatial layout. So in terms of the walling materials, I just want to give you a brief background of walling materials. So far, you can see this is what we use. We use either fired clay bricks, which we have been using since Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, I think, concrete blocks, which is what is currently in practice, but it is not at all good. We also have the Maiwan shuttering kind of walling coming up, which is very, very, extensively, it takes in the heat and it absorbs and he retains the heat inside the structures. We have hollow concrete blocks, somewhat better than the concrete blocks. And then we have the AAC blocks, probably in the last decade or so, which has come, which is probably today in the market, the most energy efficient material. So if you compare the U value of all of these materials, and I'll come to U value in a bit, you can see that the range of compressed stabilized earth blocks, even earth blocks, because it is highly compressed. The more compressed it is, the more it is going to be having a thermal transmittance, right? So you can see that compressed stabilized earth blocks is 1.6. We want a lower value, and this a benchmark that I put here. This is the benchmark for the Energy Conservation Building Code of 0.4. So you can see that there are others like 230 brick wall is 1.5, fly ash bricks is 1.3, AAC block by itself is 0.8, and concrete block with EPS, the thermocol balls, is 0.7. But AAC with insulation is coming to 0.4, and with other kind of fly ash, sorry, with insulation, and AAC with insulation is coming down to 0.4. So it's very important to get this value right in your building in order to see that the operational energy of the building is low. You will automatically see that it happens when you use the right materials, that the building energy consumption comes down. So I want to give you a little bit about thermal transmittance, or U value, which is basically the amount of energy that is, that gets transferred, the heat energy that gets transferred by a 1 square meter of wall, which has a certain amount of thickness, given a certain 1 degree centigrade difference between the two sides. So U factor is defined as heat transmission in unit time through unit area of a material. And it also includes the thin film, air film. There's an air film on both sides of a material, especially a walling material or a glazing material or a roofing material. And that is also taken into consideration in this U factor. So basically, U factor is one criteria which takes into consideration conduction, convection, and radiation effects. And therefore, it's a very appropriate, easy way of finding out whether the material is good or not in terms of thermal behavior. And the way we go about calculating U value is by calculating thermal resistance, which is the exact opposite of thermal transmittance. So this is how you can see that there is a wall, and this is the shortwave solar radiation hitting it. This is the thin film of air which has its own kind of temperature and its own effect. Some part of it gets reflected, which is not our concern. Some part gets converted to long wave radiation, which is a concern because it gets converted to heat. Most of it gets conducted inside the material itself, and then it conducts and heats up the entire structure, and the rest goes inside, is emitted as another type of long wave radiation, which is also sort of concern. So this U value takes most of these things into consideration, and therefore it is considered as a appropriate value. Now the calculation of thermal or U value goes by the calculation of thermal resistance, which is direct proportionate to the thickness and indirectly proportionate to the thermal conductivity of the material. So R is D upon K. And just not going into the details, but just to show you that you also add the RSI and RSC, which is the thin air film resistance provided by the air film next to the walling. So basically, if you have, these are the values given by Energy Conservation Building Code for those RSI and RSC. And if you have a cavity in between, even those values of the thermal resistance are provided in ACBC. This is just to show you how a U value can be calculated. You can see that the resistance of different layers of materials can be calculated just by doing that D upon K formula. And then you total it up, you get the total resistance, and you add the thin film resistance on both sides, and you get the value of R, which is 0.8026 over here. And 1 upon R gives you the U value, which is 1.246. So you can see that even though you have such a big massive wall, you're still getting a very high U value of 1.246, given that our benchmark for U value is 0.4. Just to give you a quick chart of what are the values given by the Energy Conservation Building Code 2017. You can see that 0.4 is given for most of the climatic zones. For temperate, we have a slightly higher value. And for cold regions, it is slightly even lower than these. So this is what ECBC prescribes. So another important one factor related to roofs is the solar reflectance index. Again, it is the amount of heat energy which gets directly reflected. It also includes somewhat the effects of emissivity and reflectivity, and it's a range between 0 and 1, or it is also expressed as a percentage. So you can see here that if you have, for example, red colored tiles or something, the reflectivity is 30 to 50%, which means that 30 to 50% of the heat energy gets reflected. Whereas if you have some dark asphalt or bituminous sheet or some kind of a paint, then it is between 10 to 20%. Or if you have whitewash or white paint, which is high albedo, reflectivity like snow and all that, then this is 80 to 90%. So that drastically reduces the overall amount of heat coming inside the structure. So that's like prevention right at the gate itself. So this is also very important, and you can see that ECBC prescribes some value also for the U value. Sorry, this is the U value for the roof, and you can see that it is 0.33 as compared to 0.4 for walling materials. For the SRI, the solar reflectance index, the ECBC prescribes that it should be between 0.7 and 0.75. The initial solar reflectance of a material should be 0.7. That means 70% of the heat should be reflected. And if you are not providing a painted surface or something, then you have an option of providing 50 mm, greater than 50 mm high vegetation covering the entire roof. So you can do various things here. For example, if you have an extensive garden on your roof, or a small little lawn covering the roof, or you can China mosaic, which reflects the roof, the entire energy. Or you can also have somewhat like radiant barrier materials under deck of the roof, or even on the other side of the roof. So you can have various options for making your roof. Remember that the roof is the largest horizontal surface taking in the heat energy. Not so in the case of high-rise building. In the case of high-rise buildings, the walls become really important. Now coming to windows, I just want to also tell you that in windows also we look at U value as a benchmark for finding out how good that window material is. And here again, I just want to show you this example that if you have a 4 mm float glass, the U value of that is 5.8. And if you estimate that 40 degrees centigrade is the outside temperature, then this can provide a resistance up to very little resistance. You can see that the inner temperature is 39 degrees. So there is 1 degree drop in temperature. As compared to that, if you take a cleared DGU, double glaze unit, which has a 4 mm glass, a 12 mm gap, and a 4 mm glass, then that brings down the temperature to 36 degrees. The U value of this is 2.9. Instead of this, you take a low E glass, which has a low E emissivity painting on the inside. It has a 4 mm, 6 mm, and a 12 mm gap in between. The U value comes to 1.5, and the temperature can come down from 40, it can come down to 30 degrees. And lastly, if you have a low E glass plus a combination of the cavity filled with argon gas, 15 mm wide, and then 4 mm and 6 mm, then it can come down to 24 degrees. So the point of showing you this is that you can do lots of things by having a glazing of the correct U value. In many cases, you may not be able to avoid glazing today. Of course, in the past, we did not use glazing much, but today as we are going higher, we need to have the view factor, etc. And therefore, if you want to put a lot of glazing, it is best if you restrict it to at least 40% or so, as ECBC prescribes. But if you go higher than that, at least you need to see that you have a proper U value. In any case, you can have a good U value for the glass. The second most important thing with respect to the glazing material is called solar heat gain coefficient, which is related to the direct solar radiation, and it's a comparison, a ratio of how much is outside, how much heat is outside, and how much is inside the solar radiation. Okay, so it's again a percentage or a value between the range of 0 and 1, and it takes into account all of these aspects: the direct radiation, that what is absorbed, what is reflected, what is re-radiated, and everything. So when we think about buildings and how we orient them, etc., what is really important is how the orientation of the openings are and the glazing is. So if you can protect your openings by providing the right kind of shading or something like that, then the solar heat gain coefficient will be low, and that is what you need. You definitely require more than the U factor. In the case of windows, what is important is solar heat gain coefficient. The third important thing is window to wall ratio, which is given a certain size or given a certain area of the wall, what is the percentage of window. So window area divided by wall area will give you the window to wall ratio. And it can be various percentages. So it depends, like in a warm and humid climate, probably it is best to have more windows, good cross ventilation, etc. Whereas in a hot area, hot and dry area, you may want to have smaller windows. So that's exactly the same concept, and that's what window wall ratio is about. The next thing is visual light transmission. How much light can transmit from a window? And this is again a percentage of how much light is outside and how much is inside, coming inside from the glazing that is there. And again, it's a value between 0 to 1 or 1 to 100% or 0 to 100%. So if you take a glazing, there are three very important things. One is the U value, which we already saw, the rate of heat transmission, the solar heat gain coefficient, which is the direct solar radiation entering inside. And the third thing is the visual light, how much light you're getting inside. Remember, the U factor is the non-solar heat. It's based on the difference in temperature. So this is how I would summarize it. So U value is the rate of heat transmission, solar heat gain coefficient is the heat gain due to radiation, and VLT is the rate of daylight transmission. So if you see, we need less of U value, less of SHGC, and more of VLT. So this is a typical glazing performance chart, and you can see I've highlighted the light, the solar heat gain coefficient, and the U value. And you definitely need to strike a balance here, because you will find that some glasses will provide very little light transmission, so 8%. So their solar heat gain coefficient may be also low, but we don't want so less amount of light coming in, so at least 20%. So that is how you need to strike a balance and select your glazing such that you will have low solar heat gain coefficient, low U value, and high light transmittance. The role of shading, I have already told you, it definitely has one main purpose, that it will reduce your overall heat gain, and it is characterized by a projection factor, that is the shading device that you can design. And most architects can design a shading device if they know two very important angles, that is the horizontal shadow angle and the vertical shadow angle. And you can see from this diagram that if you provide a shading device, you can directly cut off such a big percentage, almost half of the amount of direct solar radiation coming inside. So even if you want a certain amount, you can make it, or you can design a shading device which is retractable, movable, flexible, or something like that. So as I told you, you can design your shading device if you know these very simple two angles, vertical shadow angle and horizontal shadow angle, which can be easily found out for any latitude, any place. As far as vertical fenestration is concerned, I also want to show you what ECBC prescribes. So you can see that the maximum U factor is given as 3. So if you buy a typical glass just off the shelf from a vendor, the U value may be as high as 7. So what ECPC prescribes is 3. So this is quite difficult, but that is what is expected. Similarly, solar heat gain coefficient is about 0.27, that is 27%. So this is what ECBC prescribes as far as these two aspects are concerned. So to summarize, what is good is that we should have a window to wall ratio which is less than 40%. Visual light transmission should be about 0.27, and rest of the things I've already mentioned to you, the SHGC, the U factor, and all of those. Coming to the next aspect, that is thermal comfort. So I just want to quickly take you through some of the important concepts. So when we design buildings, we want to design it for comfort of the occupant with respect to all of these aspects: visual, acoustics, spatial, thermal aspect, and animate. Thermal comfort is just one of the aspects, and it's not necessary that if you provide thermal comfort, all of the rest are also done. So you need to be aware of this fact. And we as human beings have ways of exchanging heat with the surrounding environment, and it is based on the activity levels, whether you're sleeping, whether you're sitting on the computer, whether you're doing workout, or whether you're doing an office activity or whatever it is. So all of these things are very important. For a very long time, there was a search by scientists as to what could be a good comfort zone, what could be called as a comfort zone, wherein people feel comfortable. Can we design, or can buildings be made for a particular comfort zone? And it was found that a comfort zone is one where people have maximum productivity. They are able to give most of their work, or do most of their work without feeling exhausted, tired, and so on. That's because the external environment is not playing a role in their physical comfort. So this is one of the first charts designed by Olge, which shows you two aspects, that is relative humidity on the x-axis and dry bulb temperature on the y-axis. And this area in the center was the comfort zone. Of course, this was originally designed for USA, but Olge also prescribes how to change it for tropical climates. And all you need to mark is to mark your particular place using high of temperature and low of humidity, and you will know that what are the things you would need to do in your particular place. For example, some places you would not need shading, you would need solar radiation a lot. In some places you would require to provide wind. In some places you will require to provide moisture. So there are different recommendations for thermal comfort by this particular bioclimatic chart, but there are many more climatic charts that have been done. ASHRAE describes thermal comfort as a state of mind that expresses satisfaction with the surrounding environment. So although we have spoken so far about feeling physically comfort, basically thermal comfort is a mental state. It's a state wherein I feel comfortable or you feel comfortable. There are different variables of thermal comfort, that is metabolic rate, clothing insulation. These are the personal individual variables. As far as the environment variables are concerned, we have air temperature, radiant temperature, air speed, and humidity. And there are other secondary factors as well. So these are the various instruments that we generally use for measuring thermal comfort. There is also a thermal sensation scale of this is the ASHRAE thermal sensation scale, which is basically used for finding out where a person feels in terms of thermal comfort. So if I have to do a thermal comfort survey, I would use this scale and find out how people are feeling in terms of thermal comfort. And this can be put or plotted in terms of a graph. And what it says is that the percentage of people who would be dissatisfied would be only about 10%. Okay, so they would fall in the range of 0.5 to minus 0.5. Most of the people should be here. There may be a few people who are in the higher range of -2 or +2, that is they're feeling too warm or too cold, depending upon, whereas most of the people should feel in this range, that is neutral, warm, and cool. So this is the general requirement. So it says that percentage of people who are dissatisfied, PPD is less than 10. and the range of PMV is between minus 0.5 to plus 0.5. So it also has a comfort zone here as well, wherein you have operative temperature on the bottom, you have humidity ratio, and you have a thermal comfort marking. And these are for different clothing levels, okay, what you're wearing. So if you're wearing a jacket and a suit, it's called 1 klo. If you're wearing summer clothes, like a shirt and pants, so it is called a 0.5 klo. So this is the PMV graph for finding out the comfort. So you can find out whether a particular place is in the comfort zone or not. In case of India, the National Building Code provides 3 different indices for measuring thermal comfort, and this is given in the NBC 2016 as well. There are 3, that is effective temperature nomogram, there is a tropical summer index, and there is an adaptive thermal comfort. So the nomogram that we have for CET also has a small part which is marked as the comfort zone. And then it has a velocity of air, it has the globe thermometer, which is basically taken using the globe temperature, the thermometer, and it is marked over here. And then you have the corrected effective temperature, which is here. So you will have to mark the 2 of these and then connecting the line, and you'll have to find out what is the effective temperature because of the particular conditions, maybe the wet bulb, the dry bulb, and everything together, what you get. So this is one of the ways of finding thermal comfort levels in the case of India. The second and more suitable one is the tropical summer index, which I have used extensively, which includes, for example, here the wet bulb temperature, the globe temperature, and the airspeed in meters per second. So this is another way of finding out, and what the TSI value for that particular place or for that particular building will have to be between the range of 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. Optimum value is considered as 27.5, and there are higher limits of between 19 to 25 degrees centigrade on one side, and 30 to 34 is the extreme limit. So these are tolerable range on the hot side and cold side. So the tropical summer index is a very huge range of comfort levels. So it even goes beyond the latest model that has been developed in India, which is called as the Indian model for adaptive thermal comfort, created by CEPT and several other people. But now it is included in the NBC. And you can see that for naturally ventilated buildings, for different types of buildings, the values for the operative temperature, that is the neutral temperature, are provided in the IMAC. Coming to visual comfort, there are 2 aspects, daylighting and artificial lighting, both of which I'll just quickly refer to. Before that, a few points that are important to understand is the illuminance, that is the light source. Every light source, whether it is a sun or an artificial bulb, will give out lumens or lumens per square feet, which falls on a surface is lumens per square feet, which we either call as foot candles or lux. And luminous intensity is the intensity of the lumens coming out of the source, and what we perceive at the eye is the luminance in candela per square meters. So all these are some of the basic terminologies. Now, when we talk about visual comfort, what is required is that we have the adequate levels of illumination. That is a certain lux level that is required, that is recommended for that particular task. There should be uniformity of illumination. There should not be glare. Glare is excess amount of light falling from some or the other, which disturbs your eye. There should be adequate contrast. There should not be too much contrast. The colors should be as is required for that particular place, and there should not be a stroboscopic effect. There is a movement of light. So this is what is required for visual comfort. So let me talk a little bit about daylight, which is basically the controlled admission of natural light into a space through windows. So we have the freedom of designing daylighting, and daylighting can be designed very, very accurately if you want light inside your buildings. And why we need to have daylighting is that it's a free source given to us. It's just available. The second thing is that it affects our circadian rhythm and the biological clock. If we just are not next to a window and we're sitting in a place which does not give us an idea of what is happening outside, then that can be quite disturbing to our biological clock, just like when we face jet lag and so on. So all of this together is coming under something called as human-centric lighting, which basically includes three aspects: health and well-being of the person, uh, efficient lighting system, so energy reduction, and also aesthetics. So all of these things are the goal of a good daylight design. I would start with just giving you a few terminologies or some idea of how to design. So one is the daylight factor, which is just like the solar heat gain coefficient. It is a ratio between the interior and exterior illuminance. It's a percentage basically of how much light is outside and how much is coming inside from your window or your opening or something like that. And the National Building Code says that this daylighting factor, it gives various levels for daylighting, and it says that the level should be based on the clear design sky, that is a sky which is not having any clouds, etc. And it should be taken at the level of a working plane, so whatever we consider as a working plane, both outside as well as inside. So it has already given values for outside design sky illuminance for different climatic zones of India. So these are already there. If you have the interior lighting levels measured using a lux meter, then you can immediately calculate the daylight factor. However, when you want to design something, then you can do it using the daylight factor formula. And the levels of how much should be the daylight, adequate daylight for a given space, it's given by various sources, including ASHRAE, NBC, SP41, as well as various other rating systems, and also in ECBC. So if you see the NBC, National Building Code, for each and every place, sorry, I have put up things here which are not very relevant to you, but you will see there are three values always given here. And we have to always take the central value because these are for extreme conditions. The higher value of the range is used when there is unusually low reflectance, when there is accuracy or higher productivity is required and the visual capacity of the worker makes it necessary or something like that. And the lower range is also taken for special cases. So what we need to take is the middle value as the required value of illumination for a particular place. So you can see this is from one of the DCRs. I'm not sure which one, but this also shows you how much lux levels we must have for our interior spaces. Basically, the daylight factor, when you are designing for a new building, the daylight factor can be also calculated. It has three parts. One is the sky component, and that is why for designing a daylighting window, the sky is a very important aspect, because we never get daylighting from, we never take or consider daylighting directly from the sun. Daylighting is always indirect from the sky dome, and therefore how much ever you can give an opening towards the sky is much better. So you will also notice that in older buildings, the lighting windows were higher up, and that is one of the reasons. So there is a sky component, there is the internally reflected component, and sometimes there is an external disturbance, like an external building or obstruction, then there is an externally reflected component as well. So generally speaking, this would be the different cases for different types of windows or flats. And there is a formula for how to calculate the sky component. And it's very simple, H by D and W by D. And there is a table from which you can actually obtain the values of the sky component, what it would be. The second important thing is the orientation. So for that, it is recommended that the windows should be facing north or south. You should always provide daylighting windows, which are generally at a higher level, like about 2 meters. And you should have interior surfaces which are able to distribute the daylight in the interiors. In terms of the window design, you can see I'm showing you designs here. From this is the poorest quality to this, which is going to reflect your light inside, to this, which is providing shading to this window, as well as some amount of light will be reflected inside. So this is called as a light shelf. And this is the better one, wherein you have the window deep inside with a proper shading, and this one is going to increase the movement of the light, penetrate the light deep inside the floor plate. So this is how the design of the window should be. And in interior spaces, there are many ways in which you can increase the amount of light by providing light wells, by providing atriums, by providing various other skylights and so on. Sometimes it is impossible to get light inside your building, and at that time what you can do is to provide light pipes. I've not seen in India much, but it is very extensively used in northern European countries, etc., where you generally have an overcast sky. So you have light wells which simply work on the principle of internal reflection of light, and they provide light. Even from moonlight you can get good light inside the building. And you see this is actual light pipe. Okay, so there is no light actually, but it is here is the dome, and through internal, so you have a silver colored thing through which inside this pipe, which gets reflected and comes out as light inside the corridor or some other space which is deep inside the building. Glare is to be avoided. It is excessive contrast or abrupt kind of a large changes in brightness that create glare. And you can have different types of glare directly coming in, or reflected from your computer screen or a glass surface, or something that comes from behind, that is called veiling glare. All of these things are to be avoided in a good daylight design. General principles of lighting say that you can have broader openings, give you a better distribution. Taller openings will be useful for throwing the light further in. Use of light shelves will definitely help, and having a window with 20 to 25% of the sky component is one of the best ways to get daylighting inside the work plane. So I'm just giving you an example. So this is what is called as a visual window. This does not contribute to light so much because you can shut it off. It mostly contributes to heat. This provides you light, and this is an extension called the light shelf, which throws the light deep inside the building. In terms of artificial light, I don't think we have much time. So I think maybe I should go a little bit fast on this. Efficacy of the lamp is an important aspect, which is basically the division of the lumens, that is the output of the lamp divided by the wattage of the lamp. So you can have different efficacies, and I'll show you a few examples. There's also a concept called correlated color temperature. As I mentioned, we feel good when there is a warm light or a cool light, depending on various circumstances. So all types of light sources have this aspect, that is color temperature, and the color rendering index, which is how naturally they occur or can be seen in nature, and how this source of light is able to produce it. It's a range between 1 to 100. This is the visual color rendering index shown by different lights. So you can see that T5 has a color rendering index of 85%. So just to show you through 2 or 3 light sources how you can compare them. So if you take the incandescent lamp, you can see that there is a wide range in terms of the luminous efficacy. You can see this is the efficacy shown. So 15 lumens per watt, and then the color temperature, the rated life is very small. The color rendering index is very good. If you compare this with fluorescent lamps, you can see definitely the efficacy is much more. 28 watt T5 is providing 104 lumens per watt. The rated life is up to 10,000 hours. Even the heat to light output ratio is slightly better. And right now what we are using is LED lamps. So this is the LED lamp ratio for heat to light output. And the best thing about LED is that it is not using any kind of a gases for using. So end of life disposal, definitely LED is a better option. So these are the various options that we have in terms of lighting, and you can see the range of efficacy. So high pressure sodium vapor lamp, for example, has an efficacy of 108. A T5 tube light is 104, and so on. Apart from lamps, there are also luminaires, that is the fixtures that are used for putting the lamps, which can create a much better effect of light and create better visual comfort as is desired. and also the ballasts which are required to start the lamp in many of the cases, especially when they are gas based. Even LEDs have ballasts. So they also contribute to the consumption of electricity. So therefore we must be careful that we have not electromagnetic but electronic ballasts. And the last concept in this is the lighting power density, which is related to the amount of lights per square meter of space. So here also there are certain standards. This is given in watts per square meter, and ECBC also prescribes for different types of buildings what should be the LPD, the watts per meter square. I don't know if I should go ahead. There's one case study I wanted to share. Saloni, is that okay?
Yes, yes, definitely, of course.
Okay, okay. So this is the last thing I thought I'll share. If all of these things that I've discussed with a small case study, it's an actual thing where I had done the post-occupancy evaluation. So basically, low energy comfort systems are used when we go beyond this. This is all when you can do passive design and all of that. But beyond a certain point, you have to have some kind of cooling system. And that's where low energy thermal comfort systems can be very useful. So there are various ways by which you can provide low energy thermal comforts. So you have solar chimneys, you have wind scoops, you have trom walls, you have PDEC systems, you have geothermal cooling, and you have thermodrain. So what I'm going to show you is the thermodrain system, which is simply which has been what has been used in this particular case study. It's a office building in Nashik, ground plus 2-story. Total area of the terrace is 2000. Total area is 2,834 square feet. Uh, Yes. So it's basically some basic features of this building is that it's a rectangular block. So in terms of the ratio, by the way, the architect is architect Sanjay Patil, and the design of the cooling system has been done by Pan Asia engineers. So this, in terms of, I analyzed the architectural features of it, and I found that it has a perfect ratio in terms of its length and width. South, in case of Nashik, has a common wall generally with the neighboring plot. So that's also good because south brings in a lot of heat as well. It had an atrium on the north, which provided adequate daylight. The window to wall ratio was 37%, which was much below even the latest benchmark of 40%. And the window glass was laminated, so it had a low U value. The entire design was made with overhangs and chhajjas, so all of the windows were well protected with respect to the direct solar radiation. Windows on the north also faced an open space, so there was a good amount of breeze. And I noticed that there were different windows for bringing in the breeze inside, and they also had some kind of the turbo ventilators on top to activate the stack effect. Indirect natural light was there throughout the office. The external walling system was also interesting. It had a double wall with fly ash bricks on one side and red bricks from Gujarat, which were mainly for the cladding, no plastering on the outside. Turbo ventilators had provided the stack effect, and high albedo solar reflective paints were used on the terrace, so they also reflected the heat. These are some pictures. You can see this is the south common wall from which the architect tried to bring in light also here. This is the western side, generally has a lot of heat, but you can see because of the surrounding trees. So context is very important. This is the conference room on the top floor. This is the atrium facing the north. This is the west side chairman's cabin. And this is the front facade where you can see a little bit of the cladding, brick cladding that was there. So this is the thermodrain system, which comprises of these pipes which are laid out. I'll just show you the 21 mm dia plastic pipes laid out at a grid of 0.3 meters center to center. They were designed to remove 242 BTU per square feet per hour of heat. The thermal conductance of the pipe in the grid is 4.5 watts per meter square, and the total heat removed by the pipe is 77 BTU per hour. The water picks up the roof heat and passes through a radiator that rejects most of the heat. Lukewarm water is stored in an underground tank. So there was an existing tank which was made used for this in the basement. and that was used for the water that was being circulated in the entire building for the system. So this is also based on a sensor that which checks out the temperature of the water, and when the water is warmer, then it again the whole cycle starts and replaces the water. So this is how this is. So basically it is meant as a structural cooling system, which is cooling the structure throughout the day and also in the night by means of night sky radiation and also the radiator, both of these. So this is the cross section again showing how the system works. There is rejection of heat. There is a radiator, there is a water in the tank which circulates to all the slabs. And that gets water from the tank as well. This is how it works. These are pictures, actual pictures at the time of construction, after construction, and currently the radiator and the ground, etc. We did the study for 24 hours, 25 hours study actually, in the peak of summer and when it was fully occupied. And I just want to share with you the results with respect to all the thermal comfort and everything I've been talking about. So what we found, and that was interesting, that the average indoor mean radiant temperature, we had put up a black globe thermometer for 25 hours and hourly temperatures were taken, was about 33.3 degrees centigrade, and with slight deviation, but average was 33.3. And average value of 33 was good because our skin temperature, it is 37 degrees centigrade. And if there is a 33 degrees centigrade out in the room, then we are not, going to feel that coolness. The heat is not going to. There's no heat exchange happening. So also we found that people were generally using they're walking around bare feet. So the coolness of the structure was an important factor. The structure was not radiating any heat during the day. It was radiating coolness, and therefore people generally got the feeling of a coolness in the structure. Thermal comfort levels, what we took was surveys were also taken. People generally felt very comfortable in this space. However, that was not enough for us, so we decided to look at these indices that the NBC provides, and we decided to look at all of them, and here are the remarks on which one we rejected, because for example, IMAC is something that we could not choose because they required some 30 days running outdoor temperature and so on. Effective temperature, NBC itself said was not valid for certain spaces. ASHRAE was not valid beyond 30 degrees centigrade. So we chose the tropical summer index as a tool for checking out whether this place has the right values or not. And when we calculated the average values from that 25-hour study, we found that we are getting a value of 27.4 degrees centigrade. And if you recall the range, the acceptable range for TSI is 25 to 30 with an ideal value of 27.5. And what we got was 27.4. So that really was good. That explained that this structural cooling system was working and it is acceptable. And not only that, so we decided we'll also check out their electricity bills, and we took it for 1 year. And we found that their energy performance index, which is the kilowatt hour per meter square per year, was 26.5, which is very, 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 very low. I mean, even if you take your own residence, it might be something in the range of 40 or 50. So for a commercial office building, 26.5 is way too low. So that was a proof of the entire thing. So that said everything. So if you compare this with what, for example, is a benchmark given by Bureau of Energy Efficiency for a composite climate, it should be 86. And believe me, 86 also is very difficult to achieve. But this is 26.5. So they're way beyond that in terms of achieving thermal comfort, in terms of achieving the EPI and so on. And finally, some basic calculations. So if you look at the capital cost, this system was 50% of the conventional. In terms of the energy cost, 8.7% of the conventional. The cooling energy consumption, less than 10 times, and life cycle cost for 10 years, if you take, was 1/5 the cost of conventional. So definitely in terms of cost also, it's a very low energy system. So basically, I just want to summarize this presentation that what we are trying to do with all these things is to reduce our overall impact and give back to the environment, make our buildings into net zero in terms of energy, waste, and water. And I'll just show you one example, which is Paryavaran Bhavan, which has achieved a net positive status. That is, it is giving energy back to the grid. I think this is what all buildings ought to do. And finally, just to close, a few slides from a very, very old house that I visited in in Belgaum, 100-year-old mud house, which had 3 stories. Okay, so if you believe that these structures don't last, made out of mud or something, they are absolutely having no energy. I can call these buildings as net zero, and I'm sure there are millions of such buildings all over India. And it's a beautiful building, and still you can see the flooring is made out of cow dung, and the walls are still shining after 100 years of usage. So it's amazing. And unfortunately, these buildings are being chucked out. New buildings, modern concrete buildings are coming up. So this is the 3-storied mud house actually. This is the topmost story, and you can see still those colored glasses are there, still the old paintings and everything, and the flooring of cow dung. So just wanted to end my presentation today with these pictures of this 100-year-old mud house in Belgaum. And thank you.